Now, good morning to you.
Morning, Gillian.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. There's been quite a debate going on, not just in the mainstream media, but also social media as well, about what the West should do right now. Now, a lot of what the West can do is very much based on not just our willingness, but our ability to do anything to stop Vladimir Putin. Big debate has been about this no-fly zone, and many people saying, look, we should do what the Ukrainian President Zelensky is calling for, help provide that no-fly zone. But you have rather more reservations than many of those who are happy to use the hashtags on social media and, like me, are armchair generals.
Well, I can understand Zelensky asking for this. He's involved in a national war of survival, and any help he can get, he would appreciate, I think. But I'm actually quite surprised at some of the figures that have come up and suggested this no-fly zone. You've got David Davis and Tobias Ellwood. There's even a Tory MP, Alicia Cairns, advising that we should use missiles from Poland. I think there are four major problems with the no-fly zone as an idea. The first broad one is that it would widen and escalate the war. I mean, it's clear that it would do that. You're getting NATO involvement where you don't have a direct NATO involvement now. It would probably intensify the war. I think it's clear that Putin hasn't ramped up as far as he could have been, particularly in terms of air power, hasn't used it to the extent he could. So you don't know what his reaction would be to that. Further, I'm not sure that it would breach NATO's mandate. I mean, NATO is a defensive alliance. It would seem to imply intervention in a separate state. And the thing that I think has been staggering is that it doesn't seem to occur to people that are advising this escalation and widening of armed conflict, that it increases the probability of nuclear weapons being used. And a failure from the start in this has not been to take Putin at his word. So I think all of these things need to be taken into account. So on this, I think actually that Jens Stoltenberg, Boris Johnson and Joe Biden have it right.
I mean, this is it. It's uncomfortable, isn't it? But the reality is that those are, I accept all of those risks. There was a reason why Ukraine was not in NATO. Indeed, some, particularly those on the hard left, who are sort of apologists for Putin, almost to justify what Putin has done, saying, the West encouraged this by, saying, hey, come and join the EU, come and join NATO, and actually, pulling Ukraine to the West at a time when they knew that Vladimir Putin still views Ukraine as basically his sphere of influence. Now, I defend the right of any independent nation state to decide its own future and sovereignty, and there's no justification on any grounds whatsoever for Vladimir Putin to have gone in. This was not a defensive strike in any way. But we have to accept the realities of where we are. But isn't the truth that it's not just a lack of will from the West in terms of willingness to act, it's also a lack of ability? I mean, without America, without an American president willing to stand up to Vladimir Putin, Western Europe doesn't have a hope in hell. We don't have the military might, do we?
Well, it's not just military might, Julia, it's also will. And I think in a sense, Western Europe has never actually grown up.
Yeah.
They've relied on the Americans to basically guarantee security. And it was very interesting. Aris Roussenos had a piece in Unheard where he mentioned the head of the German army basically said the German army couldn't fight, couldn't engage in a real military action. Yep. Now, remember, it's not a problem of resources. I mean, if you look at defense spending, there are, defense spending broadly in US dollars between UK, Germany, France, and Russia is about the same. You have to ask yourself what the Germans are getting out of their 55 billion US they spend annually on defense. If the head of the German army says, well, they can't really do anything.
And they recently did some exercises where they had fake weapons.
Yeah, I know. It's really, you've got a cultural problem, Julia, here. I mean, these things are very complex, but I was just trying to make the point that many of often realities are dreadfully brutal. And, any morally competent person has to look at what Putin's doing in Ukraine. It's utterly reprehensible, and it is. But be very, very careful. Throughout human history, many major conflicts started small. You light the match and the forest burns down. Without breaks, you could be in a situation like that. I'm astonished at some of the things that reasonably experienced politicians have said.
But this is, it's Putin's unpredictability that makes him such a threat, but it's also his unpredictability that means, to a certain extent, we do need to act, and also why the risk of acting is so great. Because if you're thinking of him as a rational, calculating thinker, then that's one thing. But if he is mad, who we don't know, bunker mentality, not getting full information, if he genuinely cares so little for the loss of human life of Ukrainians or indeed Russians or anyone else, then his calculations were very different from those of the West. But just finally, I mean, there is still an issue. There is a big issue in the West, an inability and an unwillingness to face up to the fact that, and something we've touched on with other guests earlier, that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily think like Western democratic states. I think we've taken rather too much from totalitarian states in the last 2 years in terms of our thinking about how we tackle COVID. And I think we're going to live to regret that for decades to come. But our unwillingness to understand that they don't value freedom and democracy and freedom of speech and self-determination, that those things are foreign. They're crazy ideas to countries like China and Russia, and that we need to understand that and understand that those countries are a threat to us and our allies, and we need to be able to stand up to them.
I totally agree with you. I mean, we've played out, I think, the progressive sort of mindset, particularly the end of the Cold War mindset of triumphalism, actually, in the West was utterly deluded. We've played out in Iraq and Afghanistan at huge human cost projects to try and impose our way of life on others. And it doesn't occur to many of the people that are prosecuting these efforts that many people don't share our values and actually don't want to adopt them. And that's just a reality. And in a sense, that might be good for the West to wake up and get real.
Yeah, absolutely.